as I was saying, thank you for the invitation. And can I just say it's such a pleasure to be here and to see that Romania has chosen cohesion as the focus of their EU presidency. Because, as Barack Obama once said, inequality is the defining issue of our time. And that was in 2013. Today, the level of inequalities across the world are nothing short of calamities. Nearly half the world population live on $5.50 a day, while the wealth of billionaires is growing by $2.5 billion a day. So even after the financial crisis and the austerity time, the rich are getting richer, and the gap between the rich and the poor is getting wider. Even in Europe, which is the least unequal region in the world, in the last 40 years, the top 1% of Europeans have captured more of the Europe-wide growth than the bottom 50%. These are alarming trends because inequalities affect everyone, the rich and the poor alike. As the work of Wilkinson and Pickett has shown, for each of the 11 different health and social problems, outcomes are significantly worse in more unequal, rich countries. Inequalities also affect political behavior. As recent elections have unraveled, people are showing their discontent by either not bothering to vote or by turning to populist parties. So inequality is bad for democracy too. And that is why many consider the rise of populism as the revenge of the so-called losers of globalization, i.e. individuals and social groups who've suffered most from its consequences through job losses, depressed wages, precarious lives, and insecure futures. Well, this is certainly true. But what is missing from this narrative is the territorial dimension of inequality. If we focus solely on individuals and social groups, we risk losing sight of territorial disparities. We risk neglecting geographies of discontent, the kinds of spatial inequalities that the cohesion policy has tried to tackle for many years now, albeit with mixed and limited success. The fact that some of the beneficiaries of these policies are also voting for anti-European parties raises concern and asks for collective reflection on territorial cohesion agenda and what it stands for. To do so, it might be useful if we take a short walk down the memory lane to remind ourselves how territorial cohesion came about, what values informed its goals and objectives, and how it's evolved over the past few decades. Territorial cohesion is a normative concept with an interesting genealogy. The term itself was introduced into the European policy discourse in the 1990s, arguably by two influential French figures, Jacques Delors, the former French president, and Michel Barnier, former EU commissioner. It entered the Amsterdam Treaty alongside the promotion of social cohesion. And it also provided the rationale for the ESDP's promotion of balanced and polycentric development. In 2009, it became an official goal of the Union by entering the Lisbon Treaty as the third pillar of cohesion, along with social and economic ones. Although the term itself entered the Commission's lexicon during the 1990s, the values that underpinned it had a much longer history, going back to the social democratic and egalitarian ideals of the post-war welfare states, or what is commonly known as European social models. Despite their differences, European social models promote common values such as solidarity, cooperation, and equity. They consider social protection, development intervention, and redistributive measures as playing a crucial part in reducing inequalities. In fact, it is thanks to the pursuit of these values that Europe became less unequal in the first part of the 20th century and has since enjoyed higher degrees of social equalities than other regions of the world. The territorial articulation of these values were reflected in the post-war regional policies in many European countries. A notable example is France, so no wonder why the French were promoting territorial cohesion. In France, balanced development was a key objective of their then regional economic approach to planning. This approach put great emphasis on reducing regional disparities by proactive steering of development opportunities, public funding, and private investments towards lagging regions. A pioneering and influential contribution to this came from a 1947 book by Jean-François Gravier. It was called Paris et le désert français. He argued that because Paris was hoovering up the livelihood out of rural France, there had to be a decentralization strategy of creating, we all know, growth poles elsewhere in order to counteract the negative effect of the free markets on French provincial cities. A similar goal of achieving balanced territorial development was also articulated in the Treaty of Rome, as you can see here. These values formed the foundation of the EU regional policies of the 1970s, which aimed to improve the harmony of regional structures in the community and combat the negative effect of opening the internal frontiers. So in many ways, territorial cohesion can be seen as the extension of European social models beyond individuals and groups to places and territories. Its introduction into the EU policy discourse was an acknowledgement of the fact that people's life chances and opportunities are shaped not just by their socioeconomic standing, but also by the nature and quality of places that they live and work in. We know that there are several reasons for why territory matters and why policies should pay attention to not just people, but also places. But the one that I found most persuasive is the one which was presented in the third cohesion report. It offers a simple, normative rationale and suggests that people should not be disadvantaged by wherever they happen to live or work in the Union. Seen in this way, territorial cohesion extends the principle of solidarity between European citizens to that of cooperation between European territories. It became the spatial manifestation of European social models, as has been alluded on this slide. It was clear that the establishment of the single market would exacerbate regional imbalances due to the concentration of growth in larger cities. You can see here at the background the picture of Dublin, almost resembles Gravier's spatial imaginary. The pursuit of territorial cohesion was therefore seen as a way of counteracting the negative effects of economic integration on less developed regions. As you can see, as was also articulated very strongly by the ESDP. However, the political landscape of the 1990s, into which territorial cohesion was introduced, was not the same as that of the post-war welfare state era. It was moving away from the social democratic values that underpinned cohesion policy towards more neoliberal values, which put the emphasis on efficiency, competitiveness, aggregate growth, and the survival of the fittest, while downplaying equitable development, inclusive growth, solidarity, and cooperation. The neoliberal response to inequalities is to rely on the invisible hand of the market rather than on democratic development intervention. For Friedrich Hayek, a highly influential intellectual architect of neoliberalism, the self-organizing dynamics of the market are the ideal solutions for tackling disparities, as he elaborated in his theory of a spontaneous order. In the 1990s, these ideas were also promoted by key political figures, such as Tony Blair. In his speech at the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, just happened before the Lisbon summit, he criticized European models as outdated and urged the EU leaders to make a definitive stand in favor of market reform. Similar change of direction was happening in the national territorial policies in many European countries. This example from Denmark is particularly revealing when it says that pursuing equality is an outdated goal. The tensions between the social market model and the liberal market model came to the fore during the referendum on the EU Constitution, when many Europeans rejected it because they perceived it as too ultra-liberal and a threat to European social models. This word cloud shows the influence of these ideological shifts on Europe 2020 strategy. So although territorial cohesion is still a part of the EU lexicon, it's been gradually hollowed out of its original underlying values and become co-opted into the neoliberal strategies, according to which territorial disparities can be reduced by concentrating investment in places which can generate higher returns, because growth in these areas is assumed to eventually trickle down and reach others. This excerpt from The Economist Journal says it all. It dismisses fairness as a value, considers resisting agglomeration effects of big cities as a waste of time, and suggests that the best we can do is to let the growing cities grow further in the unfettered free market. A more absurd version of this view was presented by an LSE London School of Economics academic, who told a conference full of Liverpudlians that Liverpool's time is past and its population should be moved to the southeast of England, which is rich. Some people dismissed his remarks as laughable, but as others flagged, it was not a laughing matter. It was, in fact, a terrifying glimpse of a neoliberal strategy for cutting back public spending in some of the most deprived cities in England, because they no longer mattered. People were told that places that they called home and to which they had a strong emotional, cultural, and community ties had no future in a globalized world of fierce competition. Well, he was proved wrong. Contrary to such place-ignorant sentiments, recent elections results have shown that places do actually matter, and territorial inequalities can embolden populist backlash. As Andreas Rodriguez Pous told us in the last ESPON conference in Vienna, support for populist parties in Europe and elsewhere maps onto the geographies of long-term decline. The voting patterns demonstrate that spatially blind policies create geographies of discontent. And it was these geographies that were dubbed by Theresa May, when she became the British Prime Minister, as the left-behind places. The narrative of left-behind places, which is now used very widely, is useful in highlighting territorial inequalities. But as the title of my talk shows, I'm going to suggest an alternative. Because left behind implicitly, and maybe unintentionally, invokes a number of unhelpful messages with important policy implications. First, it essentializes globalization as an inevitable and even desirable race in which the fittest naturally run at the front while others struggle at the back. Second, it blames the victims, suggesting that being left behind is the outcome of some kind of self-afflicted endogenous deficiencies rather than global structural conditions. And third, it masks the fact that the decline of the left-behind places and the growth of those which are marching ahead are closely intertwined. They are two faces of the same coin, and one cannot be tackled effectively in isolation from the other. And that is why I think we need a change of narrative to highlight that places aren't simply left behind, they are kept behind by decades of neglect, underdevelopment, lack of investment, and ineffective policies. And this is not a trivial issue, because words matter. They carry meanings and have discursive power. So to talk about kept behind places is to unmask the hidden messages and to highlight that they are kept behind because of long-term neoliberal obsession with aggregate growth, big city boosterism, and the assumption that their growth would eventually trickle down to benefit peripheral places. So this change of narrative puts the emphasis on the lack of effective government's action for tackling decline, rather than on the inevitability and self-afflicted nature of decline. The change also contributes to the reimagining of territorial cohesion along the lines of its original underlying values. Making these values clear and explicit will boost its leverage in the EU policies, and it will help mobilize wider support for equitable development. Without these values, territorial cohesion risks becoming an empty signifier, a vacuous concept devoid of normative values and therefore deprived of persuasive power. I think a good starting point is to build on and to actually tease out and strengthen the egalitarian values that are already in Territorial Agenda 2020 and use them to inform and refocus cohesion policy and refocus it away from blanket approaches and formula-based transfer of money that are aimed at delivering GDP growth towards more tailor-made, locally led, and place-sensitive approaches that are aimed at improving quality of places and people's lives. This means starting from the place itself and then trying to understand what the place means to people who live and work there. What do they consider as social, economic, and environmental priorities of their places? What opportunities can be unlocked? And what challenges should be tackled? And only then ask the question, what types and levels of resources are needed to deliver on these objectives? It means that, for example, while investing in physical infrastructure might be the right action for one place, for another place, the right action might be the building of institutional capacity and governance capabilities. In fact, a key reason for unbalanced development in Europe is that larger cities often have greater institutional capacity for capturing opportunities. Such capacities can be enhanced by engaging in democratic, solidarity-driven cooperation. So Cohesion Fund can be used to provide the conditions which enable and incentivize cooperation across administrative boundaries and national borders, the kind of cooperation that Ilona was talking about earlier. And functional areas are often hailed as the right scale for strategic cooperation. And we're about to hear more on that from Tim. But let me finish by highlighting two related points, one about functional area and the other about the benefits of cooperation. An important issue to consider about functional areas is that they do not pre-exist our spatial relations. They're not out there waiting for us to discover them. Instead, they emerge from our spatial relations. As the pioneers of functional area approach suggested nearly 60 years ago. This means that constructed boundaries of functional areas are always dynamic and contingent, and they depend on the type of spatial relations that are given priorities and visibility. And for a long time, we know that functional areas have been imagined as an economic space, which is good if we are only interested in economic relations and nothing else. But not so good if we are interested in, for example, ecological or cultural or a whole host of other relations. So whatever functional areas we decide to focus on, they have to be fit for purpose in order to provide useful platforms for meaningful and purposeful cooperation. My second and final point is to highlight the intangible benefits of cooperation. And I've listed some of them here. Some of these are more frequently rehearsed than others. The ones that are not rehearsed include things such as formation of trust and social capital, exchange of knowledge and learning, respect for social and cultural differences, reduction of antagonistic tendencies, and isolationist attitudes. Although these sort of softer benefits of cooperation may not be immediately detectable or quantitatively measurable, they are, and I just want to finish with this line, they are the necessary ingredients for implementing territorial cohesion policies. Thank you.